American liberalism, from Gunnar Myrdal's American Dilemma to President Bill Clinton's National Conversation on Race, has consistently underestimated or devalued the autonomous dimensions of Black political discourse, extolling instead American political culture as the ablest, if not the only ideological source for Black struggles for justice and equality. Americans are fond of disruption and innovation. Man, my computer just froze on me. Second. This has never happened. I've been loosened up. Okay, sorry about that. Americans are fond of innovation and disruption. To be truly innovative now is to do what has never been done. Tell the story as it happened. Draw the history lessons of those who experienced and helped to defeat anti-democratic forces or who lived under and resisted fascist regimes within the United States. The scope of such experiences stretches from coast to coast and encompasses a century of Jim Crow that ruled martially over the lives of African Americans, Mexican Americans, Chinese immigrants, and Japanese internees. Likewise, whites often experienced the tyranny of the majority when they chose allyship over allegiance, when they chose to resist populism. In the 1950s, for example, Anne Braden worked tirelessly and courageously alongside her husband Carl to make real Henry Wallace's interracial progressive vision. She organized white women to defend Black male suspects who were routinely and falsely accused of rape and encouraged them to join civil rights campaigns against segregation. For her efforts to resist the Dixie Crack revolt, she was red-baited, blacklisted, and in 1954 charged with sedition. We can choose to build a new civic culture that sees this history not as an unfortunate diversion from the inevitable march towards progress, just as we did early on in the wake of President Obama's election. But rather, we can see this history as a necessary component to building progress. We must make it plain for the youngest of citizens and newcomers alike that U.S. democracy is in fact contingent on learning from the past, not overcoming it. Democracy can expand or contract, include or exclude, protect or destroy. But a democracy of the racially vulnerable and economically insecure is not a democracy worthy of its name. Instead, to see our democracy flourish is to demand a new origin story and new civic lessons, to embrace the revitalization of a Black public sphere, and to draw out from it the stories we keep forgetting. End of story. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Muhammad, for that wonderful talk. We have some time, I would say about 10 minutes for questions, and I think you can field them.
Sure, yes. Yes.
Thank you so much for your revealing presentation. I really appreciate it and learned so much from it. Just 3 points. The first goes to your quantitative data about George Zimmerman,
Yep.
the 41% of whites who agreed with that verdict. I find it interesting because that percentage
They
parallels...
They disapprove, right.
Right. That percentage parallels...
So wait, 86% of Blacks disapprove, 41% of whites disapprove.
41% of whites disapprove, which is interesting because that percentage number parallels the number in the white electorate that supported Obama the second time around in 2012. So there was that 4% drop off from 45% in 2008 to 41%. And I just generally think about Eric Foner's work on Reconstruction that historicizes the percentage numbers of whites who roughly supported Reconstruction as a project versus those who didn't. And it roughly broke down to about 50%, so that it's as if, half have typically been on the right side of history versus half not being on the right side. So that convergence was just particularly fascinating. The second point goes to what I'm inclined to think, at least in part, which is that increasingly I think it's just so important to underscore to the white population, the mainstream population, how practices, including racial profiling or the intensification in terms of the criminalization of the black population, hurts them as well. I mean, it's this narcissistic kind of attitude that can often determine actually when and how interventions are made. And so a part of me thinks that it's important to do the work somehow to translate in very concrete terms how a society that engages in racial profiling actually works against the interests of whites as well. A case in point, J.C. Dugard. You know, we don't necessarily want a society in which white masculinity can walk around unexamined or treated as if it's unaccountable. You know, the kidnapper of J.C. Dugard was able to carry off that neo-enslavement precisely because of the failure to scrutinize white masculinity or hold it accountable. Another example goes back to like certain serial killers, for instance, Jeffrey Dahmer, who in broad daylight can be caught with a 14-year-old boy, and yet and still, because he's white and male, somehow, even when the police are called, not face any kind of accountability. And so it's fine, you know, maybe as long as society is perfect, as long as the circumstances are perfect, but the day one's child is kidnapped, the day that anything goes wrong, then all of those mechanisms inevitably turn on the white population and work very much against their interests. Final thing, I attended the Delta National Convention in August, and so for 4 days stayed at the Mandalay Bay Hotel and Resort in Las Vegas, and was just really heartbroken to see the tragedy that unfolded there, because just less than 2 months before, I had walked, you know, those streets and really had a very visceral sense of what that environment was like. But there were a couple of things that happened in the aftermath that I think are just very instructive. First thing, you know, when that music festival was being held in Texas and the days thereafter, all these precautions were taken, like extra police on the street. You had bag checks to make sure that the environment was secure. People could have their tickets refunded if they felt uncomfortable in any way about going. And I thought, well, this is what it looks like when there's a concern about a population under threat. You know, what would happen if black communities under any kind of threat were given the option of maybe getting their money back for investments in their houses or having extra police force on the ground? So it was just all of that came to mind, but even more broadly, with the father and the son, the idea that Mark Clark and Fred Hampton could lose their lives in 1969 and yet and still be so attacked, where you have the father of this assailant be on the FBI 10 most wanted list, and yet and still, you know, produce a lineage in which none of that is relevant, and this guy is out in Las Vegas balling, spending $1 million at a time. And so it's that kind of culture that I also use as an example of how, you know, that kind of impulse to treat white masculinity as unexamined turns in certain ways.
Thank you. I think you're adding, and not so much asking, which is fine with me. I'll just say quickly that the numbers of whites who oppose kneeling, according to a HuffPost poll September 24th, in the wake of Trump's initial demand, is about 75%, as compared to 35% of black Americans who oppose the kneeling. And the reason I mention that is because those same numbers, this is really just to extend your idea, almost mirror the same number of people who supported stop and frisk in New York throughout most of those years. It lasted for 12 years, formerly under Bloomberg. And so you consistently had essentially 70% of white New Yorkers across the entire jurisdiction supporting what by 2012, which are the numbers I'm reciting to you, was under full-scale attack by the New York Civil Liberties Union, by activists, by young people, was in the news, I did Moyers in 2012, talking about stop and frisk. So it was out. And so if you were white and sort of thought that you were saving black lives by thinking this was a good policy, at some point you had to be willfully ignorant or simply reject the arguments that were being made by a broader black public sphere that were taking on this issue. So your examples of toxic white male masculinity are the other side of the coin that is expressed here, at least historically, through Frederick Hoffman and so many others who went to bat, essentially, for toxic white masculinity and however it expressed itself, whether it was an Italian American in a knife thrust or not. And what I'm essentially arguing here, two things. One, that not enough of black folks are caring for their own heritage around what it means to have been black at various points in American history and made this country better, period. And so when I quote Touré and Eugene Robinson, who was not advocating for this was a critical assessment, but essentially too many of us have tried to transcend our own history and have tried to get on the other side of it and announce that we don't have to teach our children, we are past all of that. And so when I congratulate the Mundays here for being rare birds for investing in Africana studies, unlike too many folks, they're investing in a commitment to these stories that they will live on in the work of other people, both scholars, students, and a broader community. And that is far too rare. Of course, the larger challenge is a transformed civic culture that doesn't dispute or try to ridicule or disdain blackness, but in fact sees it as a legacy. That is a heavy lift, don't get me wrong. But we can't keep asking ourselves why we keep coming back to this. We can't keep asking ourselves, what are we going to do about it? Because we've had solutions proffered for 150 years, at least since Frederick Douglass stood in the middle of slavery and said, if we don't see these people's humanity, first and foremost, we will be the greatest hypocrites the world has ever known. And so the choice is in front of us. Learn from that past, teach it to our children, commit to it, and be better. So please don't ask me, what do I think we should do about it? That's just yes, Professor Harris.
Yeah, it seems to me like we're in a different historical moment where many of the younger scholars, you, Eddie Glaude, Carol Anderson, are speaking truth to power in a way that when individuals did the same thing, I'm just picking a number out of the air, 40 years ago, they were dismissed as being red. You understand what I'm saying? Okay. Now, is Donald Trump trying to bring back that period so that you guys, this younger generation, might be dismissed?
That's such a great connection to Americanism and to this litmus test of loyalty that is playing out in NFL and now is presumably going to, we may see some more in the NBA. Tuesday was not such a great start for seeing NBA players take a knee, but you're exactly right. And I tried to make that connection more explicit by saying that the notion of 100% Americanism, which came with the KKK, is a ideological parent to the patriotism and loyalty test of a post 9/11 world, which means that America comes first and everything else is subverted to that. Which is why the collapsing of military worship and policing has completely blurred the lines between civilians who are here to serve us and to occasionally protect us from ourselves, have become, by definition, soldiers on a battlefield and heroes. And Trump has harnessed that in the same way that the great era of Palmer raids of the 1920s, a toxic environment where the dissent was completely eradicated across multiple sectors of society against the notion of expanding democracy, repeated itself in the age of McCarthyism and anti-communism. So that history is right in front of us, and is playing out. And so, to your point, literally, I think you're exactly right.
We have time for one last question.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I'm not going to ask you what you're going to do about it, but what do you think the new academic should look like in the future? Is it that there should be a more activist learning project, or should it be more engaged? I look at the Globe as an artist, and Project Row Houses in Texas, and P.S. Gaze as an artist planner. So is that where the academia or academic should be heading towards?
Oh, I love you mentioning those two examples. And I know the Astro's project better because I know the Astro and I've been there. And so he, of course, is an artist first and is an academic second. He's at the University of Chicago. I recognize that. We should identify in that way. It doesn't really matter whether they are formally trained with PhDs. The notion that our intelligentsia see themselves having the opportunity and the obligation to move the work from being siloed in the studio or in the classroom to the public sphere, which is why I use that term not to evoke scholarship here, but to evoke people who are actively in that public sphere of various kinds, from a writer like Coates to an athlete like Kaepernick, and or Bree Newsom as an activist in the case of bringing down the Confederate flag. I have an argument. This is sort of a project waiting to be written, but one could write the counter-revolution of the 1980s forward, from Reaganomics to the war on drugs, as a project abetted, perhaps unintentionally, by the movement of a Black progressive movement from the streets to the campus. And the unintentional consequence of that was that some of the smartest minds and people whose sense of history and social analysis that had often been birthed in the interplay of college going and living in a community has yielded little fruit until quite recently. Now that's a tough thing to swallow because it is not a repudiation of education. That is not the point. The point is that people who might have done other things in the service of social justice or economic transformation ended up seeing the university as the best path to do that, when in fact the counter-revolution, I would argue, opened up the university in some ways to absorb that dissent. But it's tricky, because just as I mentioned Derek Black, the white nationalist, young person, if he hadn't gone to college, he'd still be a white nationalist. So it really is a both and. It is both the work that we do on these campuses, as well as the possibility for the work that we should and can do off campuses, which is exactly why I went to the Schomburg Center, and which is exactly why, as far as I'm concerned, the Schomburg Center has an even greater obligation in the wake of the Trump election. Don't tell anybody this, but if I had known Trump was going to become the next president, I might not have left the Schomburg Center. But it is precisely the need to close the gap, both in knowledge and in skills and tools, between what activists are doing on the street and what they bring to the equation, and what scholars are doing in their classrooms and what they bring to the occasion. And some of the best work and transformative work that is happening in this country is mobilizing those relationships. Barbara Ransby, for example, at the University of Illinois at Chicago, is not only the author of the authoritative biography of Ella Baker, the godmother of SNCC and the leading organizer of NAACP chapters in the 1940s and 50s. She's basically living Ella Baker's legacy. She is part of an infrastructure of academics who are supporting the work of the Black Youth Project 100 and Black Lives Matter activists more generally, and Asada's Daughters. There are a number of organizations in Chicago that have had tangible victories. Chicago was the first place to see a reparations award for victims of police brutality. In the case of John Burge, who was a commander of a black ops operation that tortured 200 black people from the 70s to the 1990s. And to add to that, I mean, this is really modeling precisely what you're asking for in a concrete example. So not only did they win the reparations suit, the activists working with an academic who could bring Ella Baker's entire legacy to life in real ways to give that to them. So it's a both and. They're going to do the work. They have their own ideas, and they know what the menu of options are that they want to see, but they're also being informed by this history through the voice of this academic. They also got, in the reparations agreement, a curriculum, a mandatory curriculum unit that would then teach this case to all Chicago public school students. So we have the potential to do so much more if we in fact are willing to do it. So thank you for the question.